We are so grateful for your company this afternoon here on Court TV Live. Welcome back. I'm Julie Grant. We are anxiously awaiting for the sentencing to begin for convicted murderer Derek Chauvin. We have our courtrooms positioned in the Minneapolis, Minnesota courtroom where it all will be taking place. Right now, no action happening just yet. We know that some folks are making their way into the courtroom. We're restricted on what exactly we can show. So right now, this is a live picture of just the seal of the great state of Minnesota on the wall there in Judge Peter Cahill's courtroom. He is the trial judge on this matter. We know this was a jury trial. Derek Chauvin elected to have his case heard by a jury. We know that they delivered a verdict of guilty on all of the counts, the most serious of which is second-degree unintentional murder. And it carries a maximum potential penalty of 40 years in prison. Now, because this case involved one victim, and we have 3 counts here, for sentencing purposes, those other 2 counts on the indictment are merging. So he'll be able to be sentenced on one of them. The most severe penalty under the law could be 40 years. But we know this is someone who has no prior criminal history, and his guidelines are calling for something around 12 and a half years, a range of 10 to 15, if you will. There are also aggravating factors here that the state has presented and the court has agreed with. Things like children were present, that it was particularly cruel, that Chauvin abused his position of authority, and that there was the participation of other people when the crime occurred. So the judge may use those aggravating factors to go upward from the guidelines. Let me bring in for analysis while we wait criminal defense attorneys who both have served as former prosecutors as well, Marcia Minot and Brian Watkins. Marcia, let me start with you. I want to get your prediction, if I can, please. I know you're well aware of the state asking for 30 years in prison, the defense asking for probation and credit for time served. You know well what the aggravators are. How do you think the court is going to come down with the sentence today?
Because of how the state presented the case, systematically putting the evidence in, I think that the court is going to go with what the state has requested, especially since they're not asking for the maximum penalty, which is 40 years.
Marcia, appreciate it. Brian, same question to you, please. If you had to make a prediction on how the judge is going to decide here on the penalty, what would you say, please?
You know, Julie, this is the deal. This is what it all breaks down to. Derek Chauvin has to take the stand and express remorse. He has to explain to the judge his mistake or why he did what he did and why he thought that what he was doing was correct. And he has to explain and show the world and the judge that he is remorseful. A defendant who is not remorseful does not get any downward departures whatsoever. It can only be aggravated. Expressing remorse, accepting responsibility for your actions, and being remorseful is the #1 way you get a downward departure. Without that, his sentence will be aggravated. It will be something more than the 12 to 15 years. Will the judge go all the way up to 30? I don't know. But unless he explains to us why he did what he did, and he has to express some sorrow, if he does not do that, you're looking at a 30-year sentence.
I wholeheartedly agree with you. And I'm so glad you brought that up, because that was another question that I have for you both. You're very seasoned trial attorneys. And I wanted to ask you, if you were in the position to be Derek Chauvin's counsel on this one, how would you advise him when it comes to speaking to the court and to the world, as we know, that's watching, at his sentencing? And Marcia, I'll go to you first for that, please.
The only reason why I would not have Mr. Chauvin testify at his sentencing hearing is because I know for certain his case is going up on appeal. And that any statement that he makes, even in his sentencing portion, could be used against him or could affect the appellate rights that he has. So because of that, I understand that you have to show remorse. I know that courts are looking for remorse. I know that victim family members are looking for remorse. But unfortunately, in this situation, my bet is on he will not take the stand today because of the appellate rights.
And I appreciate that argument. And let's keep going with that if we can, please. Brian, let's just say he's not admitting guilt at this juncture, because we know he still wants to fight it, but just to say he's very sorry for what occurred and look at the members of George Floyd's family and express a heartfelt apology. Could that be held against him on appeal?
No. I mean, is sorry for what occurred. He's sorry that a man lost his life. He did not want a man to lose his life. These are statements that will not affect his appeal whatsoever. And these are statements that the judge is going to have to hear in order to do any downward departures whatsoever. These are statements that the victim's family are going to want to hear. And he needs to look that victim in the family and say, I'm sorry that this happened. Now, he doesn't need to go into the details about what happened or anything like that, but expressing remorse that an individual lost his life that day, that he really didn't have to happen. You've got to express remorse for that, and that will not affect him on appeal whatsoever.
Brian Watkins, Marcia Minot, it is so great to have your legal insight and expertise on the program. We're going to step aside for a break because we know that at 2:30 p.m. Eastern Time, that is the time that the judge is expected to take the bench and the sentencing hearing will begin. Thank you for watching Court TV Live, your front row seat to justice.
Convicted for the murder of George Floyd.
We, the jury, in the above entitled matter as to count one,
Former Officer Derek Chauvin.
find the defendant guilty.
learns his fate.
Our cameras will be there.
And our teams are live, bringing you every update.
In a larger-than-life trial like this, the story continues after the verdict.
People will see for themselves the ultimate result in this case.
The sentencing of Derek Chauvin. Live coverage today at 2:30, 1:30 Central on Court TV.
You are watching Court TV Live, your front row seat to justice. I'm your midday host, Julie Grant, and we appreciate you joining us on this Friday afternoon. It is a big day in the case for defendant Derek Chauvin. He's been convicted of murdering George Floyd. That jury verdict coming in April, and now here we are on the 25th day of June. And the 45-year-old former police officer is set to learn his fate for his crimes. We have our cameras already in position in the courtroom ready to go. His Honor had designated 2:30 p.m. Eastern Time as the time that he would be taking the bench and the attorneys would be giving their arguments. A little bit of a preview of what's set to happen. Both sides will have a chance to argue their respective positions on the sentencing guidelines and on the sentence that the court ought to impose. And then there will be time for statements. And members of George Floyd's family, of course, his loved ones, will be able to present some victim impact statements. The defense will have a chance to present witnesses, any impact statements that they have. And of course, Derek Chauvin has the right to give any testimony and share with the court whatever he wishes. Again, that can't be held against him if he doesn't, but he has the right to speak and address His Honor today before His Honor imposes the sentence. And you may have seen, we reported that Attorney General Keith Ellison solicited community impact statements on this case. That was something somewhat rare, and we know that they have been submitted, and we understand that today, while they won't be read into the record for us to hear, they will be marked as exhibits and submitted into the record for sentencing. We're just getting word that Derek Chauvin has walked into the courtroom. And again, we're restricted on what we can show when. As soon as we can bring you a live picture, we will. He also is permitted to be in civilian clothing. There was an order that was just issued by the court that he will wear a suit rather than jail clothes. Let's listen.
27 CR 20-12646, matters on for sentencing. Counsel, note your appearances beginning with the state.
Good afternoon, Matthew Frank, Assistant Attorney General on behalf of the state.
Good afternoon, Your Honor. Jerry Blackwell from the state of Minnesota.
Good afternoon, Your Honor. Steve Swisher on behalf of the state of Minnesota.
Your Honor, Keith Ellison, Attorney General on behalf of the state of Minnesota.
And for the defense.
Good afternoon, Your Honor. Eric Nelson and Amy Voss appearing on behalf of Mr. Chauvin.
Thank you. We are still, for all those attending, under somewhat modified COVID restrictions, so we are asking that everyone keep their masks on unless they are speaking. I'll ask for people who are speaking to come up to the lectern and use the microphones, and please to remove your mask so that we can hear you clearly, and also to maintain the distances that we have set out in the courtroom. With that, we'll proceed first with the state. Mr. Blackwell, you may proceed with victim input.
Your Honor, we have 4 victim impact statements. We will start with the 7-year-old daughter of George Floyd, Gianna Floyd, who will present hers by video.
What do you miss most about your daddy?
Well, I ask about him all the time. And that's kind of it.
Yeah. Well, when you ask about him, what are you asking about?
Well, I was asking, how did my dad get hurt?
Do you wish that he was still here with us?
Yeah, but he is.
Through his spirit?
Yes.
Yes. And when you see your daddy again one day, what do you want to do when you see him?
I want to play with him.
What kind of games do you want to play with him?
I want to play with him, have fun, go on a plane ride, and that's it.
Yeah. Would you?
We used to have dinner meals every single night before we went to bed. My daddy always used to help me brush my teeth.
Oh. Do you miss him helping brush your teeth?
Yes.
How do you hope that the world remembers him?
Well, they helped him because those mean people did something to him.
Yeah. If you could say anything to your daddy right now, what would it be?
It would be, I miss you and I love you.
All right. Thank you, Gianna. I really appreciate you answering questions today.
That was Gianna Floyd. Your Honor, next we'll hear from the nephew of George Floyd, Brandon Williams. Mr. Williams.
If you could begin by giving us your full name and spelling each of your names.
Brandon Williams, BRANDON WILLIAMS.
You may proceed.
On Monday, May 25th, 2020, George Perry Floyd Jr. was murdered by Derek Chauvin in a malicious and insidious display of hate and abuse of power. Chauvin killed George. Not only did he kill George, but he also displayed a total lack of consideration for human life as he did so. You saw it, I saw it, and millions of people across this country and the globe witnessed the act of hate. A year and 1 month later, I stand there before you tasked with the duty of expressing how George's death has impacted me personally and the rest of our family. As I racked my brain and thought about what I could say today, I came to this conclusion. It is humanly impossible for me to stand here and convey or articulate the right words that would capture all that we are feeling and what we have felt over this period. So please bear with me as I attempt the impossible. The sudden murder of George has forever traumatized us. You may see us cry, but the full extent of our pain and trauma will never be seen with the naked eye. The heartbreak and hurt goes far beyond any number of tears we could ever cry. Words simply cannot express the pain, anguish, and suffering that our family and friends have endured since George's murder. It has been truly unimaginable, but not as nearly unimaginable as the defendant's decision to take the life of a human being with no regard for the effect it may have on others. Although Chauvin will be sentenced today and spend time in prison, he will have the luxury of seeing his family again, talking to them, and he will likely get to spend time with them upon his release. These are all luxuries that my young cousin Gianna was robbed of when Chauvin made the active decision to kill our father. There will be no more birthday parties, no graduations, holiday gatherings, or other family celebrations. The laughter, hugs, guidance, advice, sense of security, and those opportunities to simply say I love you are forever gone. They say time heals all, and while I generally believe that saying, it's challenging to do so given these unfathomable set of circumstances. Before I conclude, I must highlight a few things. George's murder, this trial, and everything in between has been tragic and devastating. Our family is forever broken, and one thing we cannot get back is George Floyd. It is the request of my family that the maximum penalty for the crime for which the defendant was convicted be imposed. On behalf of my family, friends, community, and supporters, I wish to express my sincerest gratitude for allowing us opportunities of expression. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Your Honor, first, just for the record, this wonderful lady standing here is a Hennepin County victim advocate.
Ms. Boswell is well known to the court.
Yes, thank you, Judge.
And so, Your Honor, we'll next hear from the brother of George Floyd, Mr. Terrence Floyd.
And Mr. Floyd, if you could state your full name, spelling each of your names.
Yes. Terrence Floyd, that's Terrence, Floyd, Floyd.
Go ahead.
I'm here representing my brother. I'm from New York. On May 25th, 2020, my brother was murdered, everyone knows, by Derek Chauvin. The facts of this case were proven beyond a reasonable doubt, and 3 guilty verdicts have been rendered. This situation has really affected me and my family. Any family member that has went through this, we are part of a fraternity of families, and it's not one of those, fraternities that you enjoy. Over this last year and months, I actually talked to a few people, and I wanted to know from the man himself, why? What were you thinking? What was going through your head when you had your knee on my brother's neck? Why, when you knew that he posed no threat anymore, he was handcuffed, why you didn't at least get up? Why you stayed there?
You take your time.
A month before my brother was murdered, I was on the phone with him, and we had a long conversation. And as I looked at the video of my niece, the last conversation me and my brother had was he wanted to have play dates. He wanted to plan play dates with Gianna and my daughter. And we started setting it up. That can't happen. And I have to, my daughter's still young, but I still have to explain to her, because this is history. This is a case everybody knows about. So she's gonna find out, and I'm gonna have to explain that to her. And I think that's, to me, harder than even just standing here, that I have to talk to my daughter and tell her, about her niece, about her uncle, about the situation. That's basically reliving it all over again, years down the line. I'm here on behalf of my family, on behalf of me and my family, we seek the maximum penalty. We don't want to see no more slaps on the wrist. We've been through that already. In my community, in my culture, we've been through that already. Smacked on the wrist. No. Because if it was us, the roles was reversed, there wouldn't be no case. It would have been open and shut. We'd have been under the jail for murdering somebody. So we asked for that same penalty for Derek Chauvin. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Your Honor, the final victim impact statement for the state will come from George Floyd's brother, Phalonis Floyd.
And sir, if you could begin by giving us your full name and spell each of your names, and I have permitted you to use your phone because you have notes on it, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
All right, and you may proceed when you're ready. Giving us your full name first.
Floyd, spelled Philonise, last name Floyd, Floyd.
And you may proceed.
One year ago, May 25th, my brother George was murdered by Derek Chauvin and his co-defendants in broad daylight with a knee to his neck for 9 minutes and 29 seconds. I was a trucker, and immediately my life changed forever. I began to speak to the world for George from the United Nations, Africa, Canada, Japan, and so many other countries. Every day, I have begged for justice to be served, reliving the execution of George, while others begged and pleaded for Officer Chauvin to simply just allow George to take a breath. I haven't had a real night's sleep because of the nightmares I constantly have hearing my brother beg and plead for his life over and over again. Even saying, "They're going to kill me. Please, officer." Screaming for our mom. I have had to sit through each day of Officer Derek Chauvin's trial and watch the video of George dying for hours over and over again. For an entire year, I had to relive George being tortured to death every hour of the day, only taking naps and not knowing what a good night's sleep is anymore. I've been lifting my voice tirelessly every day so that George's death will not be in vain. Honorable Judge Peter Cahill, I thank you for allowing me to share this today. George's life mattered. So my family and I, most of all, my niece, Gianna. My niece, Gianna, she needs closure. I'm asking that you please find it suitable to give Officer Chauvin the maximum sentence possible, charge that he has been found guilty for. My family and I have been given a life sentence. We will never be able to get George back. Daddy's our daughter's first love. He would never be able to walk Gianna down the aisle at her wedding, attend those magical moments of her life like a daddy-daughter dance, sweet 16 party, seeing her out for prom graduations, and she would never be able to have any personal memories with her father. With a smirk on his face and children present, Officer Chauvin used excessive force and acted against his training. Chauvin had no regards for human life, George's life. I stand before you today asking you to please help us find closure by giving Chauvin the maximum sentence possible, making sure he does this time consecutively without the possibilities of parole, probation, or getting out early for good behavior. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Frank.
Thank you, Your Honor. Here today, of course, for sentencing, gives us an opportunity to speak about other matters that I think are involved in sentencing and where we are in the criminal justice system in the processing of this case. As a member of an elected office representing the people of the state of Minnesota, as well as the people of the local community, I want to say a couple of things. And first of all, I want to really thank some of the police officers at the Minneapolis Police Department. who, under great pressure, great stress, and to some extent at peril to their occupations, what they've devoted their life to, stuck to their oath and their commitment as police officers to speak openly and honestly about policing and the training that is given and received by police officers. Those officers didn't hide behind a blue wall. They came forward. They told this court and those jurors what they knew about training and responsibility. And I think they deserve recognition and credit for that. I would also like to thank members of the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension. You know, those agents get called in, great sacrifice to their personal lives. Whenever things happen, they go. They did that here, and under really extraordinary circumstances, completed a very professional and thorough investigation. You know, conducting interviews is hard enough, but conducting them in the atmosphere of the city following the murder of George Floyd was even more difficult. And they did so, I think, above and beyond the call of duty. And I want to thank them for doing that on behalf of the whole prosecution staff. Your Honor, I want to thank the family, the loved ones, the friends of George Floyd. They have been through so much more than families involved in murder cases. He's right. It's a fraternity you don't want to be part of. But they've been through so much more because of the pandemic and because of security, safety precautions that we've had to take. They have been through a lot. At a time when they try to grieve, like everybody does for the loss of someone, they are going through so much more. And I want to thank them, all of them, the family. The court saw a testimony from Philonise Floyd, Courtney Ross. These are people who are trying to deal with their loss, but they have to do it in a very public way and under very trying circumstances through no fault of their own. So I thank them. They have all been models of grace and understanding. And it's really remarkable, quite frankly. I'll, I think, come back to them again in a little bit. Your Honor, we have submitted a sentencing brief. I would incorporate that. I guess I would incorporate my comments today into that memo. But I do think there are things that I want to bring out today in my arguments. For hundreds of years, the court had discretion in sentencing. It was the trial court's decision on what a sentence should be. The recognition that the trial court sat through the trial, watched the evidence, and saw how it affected people, informed the court's discretion. When the legislature passed the guidelines, in a legitimate attempt to try and even out sentences, they defined certain presumptive sentences, as we all know, for typical crimes. For each crime, the typical crime. But they did not remove discretion for sentencing judges. They recognized that nobody is better suited to decide whether this is the typical case represented by that guideline's presumptive sentence, or if there are reasons why this is worse than that. And it gave, and the guideline still gives this court discretion when there are aggravating factors to give a more serious sentence than what the guideline's presumption calls for. And as you know, we are asking you to do that today. As this court found, there are 4 aggravating factors that we have identified. They go beyond a list of just what those factors are. We have not just done our homework and found a list. The court made good findings, detailed findings about those factors, and we think they justify a greatly increased sentence. This is not the typical second-degree unintentional murder. The Supreme Court in our state has said that, and very recently, even one aggravating factor is sufficient to go twice the top of the range. Here we have 4. The first one that the court found is an abusive position of trust and authority. And the court specifically found that when Mr. Chauvin was acting as a police officer, he had a position of trust and authority. That is certainly true. We trust police officers. We trust them when we need help. We call them for help. We trust that they're going to take care of the problems that they are assigned to deal with, right? We trust them. We also give them great authority. We give them great power. We give them power to use force that individuals would be prosecuted for using, right? We give them authority to arrest, to detain. And with great power, of course, comes great responsibility. So they're not sent out there by themselves to do this. They're given substantial training. This court saw all of that through the trial, in general and in specific to Mr. Chauvin and the other 3 officers. They're given training on the use of force, the proportional use of force. The force used has to be warranted by the threat. They're given training on de-escalation because we recognize that police officers are called in when people are not having their best day, when people might be affected by mental illness, drug abuse, any number of issues. They're just having a bad day, and they're trained for that and should be. And they're taught how to use that to de-escalate and control a situation. They're taught medical intervention. They're taught to provide medical attention to people who need it. Being a police officer is a difficult job. We ask a lot of them. It's a profession, there's no doubt about it. But we give them a substantial amount of training, and most officers do it right. This case wasn't about police officers, all police officers. It wasn't about policing. This case was about Derek Chauvin disregarding all that training he received and assaulting Mr. Floyd until he suffocated to death. One of the things that you heard, Your Honor, and the jurors heard that can really encapsulate, I think, a very important issue here. 7 words: in your custody is in your care. And it's a real simple mantra. It's a real easy thing to remember. You're going to take custody of somebody, you have to provide care. You have to do it in a caring way. You can't simply disregard their care. Mr. Chauvin abused his position of trust and authority as a police officer by doing just that, just disregarding all his training. It was an abuse of that because what did he decide to do? We often are forced in this, criminal justice system to infer people's state of mind by their conduct and their statements. What was Derek Chauvin's endgame here? What was the plan? It seems apparent the plan was hold him down until we can dump him in an ambulance and no longer have him be our problem. You recall he said to Charles McMillan, he's a big guy, might be on something. That's it. He held Mr. Floyd down as Mr. Floyd begged for his life. He had the other officers help in that regard. And rather than doing the simple expedient of putting him on his side, he said, yeah, He was dismissive to that duty of care. We trust that arrestees will be treated with respect, reasonable force, and that their medical needs will be addressed. I'm paraphrasing from the court's findings. That trust was violated. We trust that they will use their authority reasonably, and this was a particularly egregious abuse of that force. Again, paraphrasing the court's findings. The typical second-degree murder does not include, does not involve that extent of abuse of a dearly held position of abuse or a position of authority and trust by the community and by individuals of the community. Your Honor found that Mr. Floyd was treated by Mr. Chauvin with particular cruelty. I think tortured is the right word. We know that, I mean, we've all seen it. Mr. Floyd did not want to be in the back seat. That's it. I mean, that's the rub. It was the need to get him in that back seat no matter what. And we all saw that once he was pulled out of that back seat, he calmed right down, even willingly went down to the ground. I'm going down, he said. And he went down to the ground, not fighting, not punching, and he was placed initially on his side. He's already handcuffed. He's placed on his side in the recovery position, like he should be, because he's trying to breathe, and then quickly placed prone on the ground, face down. Mr. Chauvin put his left knee on George Floyd's neck, his right knee on George Floyd's back, face down on the pavement. Had Officer King sit on Mr. Floyd's waist area, and had Officer Lane hold his feet down. You can even see Mr. Floyd trying to pull his feet up. We all are going to fight to breathe. Everybody knows that fear when you all of a sudden realize you're having trouble breathing. It's just innate, right? We want to survive. We know we have to breathe. And there's an automatic reaction when you begin to feel like that is threatened. And you can see Mr. Floyd going through that. He tries to pull his feet up. But he's held down by these three officers while Officer Tao is looking on. And later, of course, goes to keep the people who want to help away. He's placed face down on this pavement so harshly that it rubs the skin off his face. He has injuries to his face from being face down on that pavement. He has injuries to his knuckles from just trying to lift himself up. And he's telling Officer Chauvin, I can't breathe. I'm dying. And Mr. Chauvin's response was, And all this time, I mean, imagine what Mr. Floyd is going through. If we're going to talk about particular cruelty and torture, really try to appreciate what he's going through. He knows he's suffocating. We all know that feeling of not being able to breathe enough. And he's begging, he's pleading, and he's being ignored. His concerns are being dismissed by somebody who has taken custody but not care. He was kept in that prone position for 9.5 minutes and was suffocated. There's no other way to say it. That's particularly cruel. That is more cruel than a typical second-degree unintentional murder. Significantly more. This is not a momentary gunshot, punch to the face. This is 9.5 minutes of cruelty to a man who was helpless and just begging for his life. This court found that there were children present, standing only a few feet from these officers. These children, who were ages 17 and one child age 9. Why is that an aggravating factor? Well, I think everybody can figure that out. Right? It's particularly bad to commit a crime in front of children. We've heard a lot of academia about the development of the young brain and how long it can take. And here you got a couple of teenage girls and a 9-year-old girl. How are they going to process this? Standing feet from a man being suffocated by police officers. Such a stark sight that one of the children even says, we got to call the police on the police. How do you process that as a 9-year-old? The children were not only present watching a man die. We've all seen, if you haven't, you really need to look at George Floyd's face as he's dying, he's suffering. The children have to watch this. But not only that, it's police officers, and there are people around them wanting to help. And at one point, and sure, they got upset. And at one point, Mr. Chauvin points his mace, grabs his mace to keep him back. How does a child look at that? There's another officer screaming at them to get back. The typical second-degree unintentional murder doesn't involve children standing feet away watching the 9.5-minute suffocation of a man begging for his life. This court also made a finding that the defendant committed the offense with the involvement of 3 or more other persons. Lane and King were involved directly in the restraint, and that Tao kept the bystanders at bay. I've already talked a little bit about Lane and King's role in holding Mr. Floyd down. They recognized that he was pulseless, that Mr. Floyd was pulseless at one point, and yet really made no effort to take care of the person in their custody. Officer Tao watched most of the suffocation and then only went over to keep people from giving help. One person who is identified as a medical trained firefighter for the city of Minneapolis, and that was dismissed. Like, are we going to believe her? So they kept trained medical people from providing help. These were all uniformed peace officers, adding to that abuse of trust and authority. You know, I know the defense has asked the court for probation. I'm not going to spend a lot of time arguing that. It's so outside of the realm of, I think, real possibility. This is a murder. I understand some of the arguments made on behalf of Mr. Chauvin. I understand, well, no, I can't understand what his family members and friends are going through. I can't. But it's certainly not enough for a departure to probation for a second-degree murder. We believe, Your Honor, that these 4 aggravating factors and the findings that the court has made certainly justify an upward departure because there are 4 of them, not standing alone, but in a sense, not overlapping, but coming together to show this is not the typical second-degree murder. This is egregious. And this justifies a double upward departure. From the top of the box, which is 180 months, we're asking the court to do a double departure, recognizing all 4 factors, to 360 months. As I mentioned before, Your Honor, this is sentencing. This is the time for victims, right? This is the time for the loved ones of the victim and the community to have a say. Again, I commend this family. I commend all of the loved ones, the friends, the people that have been involved in this case for tolerating and being gracious. None of this, of course, can bring George Floyd back. That's very true. But this is the time for our criminal justice system to say, we hear you. This is the time for their criminal justice system to say, we recognize that this harm you're going through is real, and while we can't feel what you're feeling, we know we can do what your criminal justice system should do and recognize the severity of this crime and reflect that in the sentence to be given. It's time for this criminal justice system to say, we recognize this is more serious than the typical second-degree unintentional murder. The 4 reasons the court found reflect that and give this court more than an adequate basis to do that. Your Honor, we ask the court to impose a sentence of 360 months, commitment to the Commissioner of Corrections. As you know, Your Honor, there are no fines in murder cases. And we would ask the court just to reserve the issue of restitution. So we can clarify that with the family and present that to the court for 30 days. Thank you, Your Honor.
Anything further from the state?
No, Your Honor.
All right. Mr. Nelson. I'm sorry. Mr. Blackwell?
I'm sorry, Your Honor, just,
Thank you, Your Honor. Your Honor, at this time, the defendant's mother, Carolyn Palenti, would like to address the court.
If you could state your full name, spelling each of your names, and proceed when you're ready.
Carolyn, Carolyn, Palenti, Pawlenty. I am the mother of Derek Chauvin. I am here to speak on behalf of my entire family. On November 25th, 2020, not only did Derek's life change forever, but so did mine and my family's. Derek devoted 19 years of his life to the Minneapolis Police Department. It has been difficult for me to hear and read what the media, public, and prosecution team believe Derek to be an aggressive, heartless, and uncaring person. I can tell you that is far from the truth. My son's identity has also been reduced to that as a racist. I want this court to know that none of these things are true and that my son is a good man. Derek always dedicated his life and time to the police department. Even on his days off, he would call in to see if they needed help. Derek is a quiet, thoughtful, honorable, and selfless man. He has a big heart, and he always has put others before his own. The public will never know the loving and caring man he is, but his family does. Even though I have not spoken publicly, I have always supported him 100% and always will. Derek has played over and over in his head the events of that day. I've seen the toll it has taken on him. I believe a lengthy sentence will not serve Derek well. When you sentence my son, you will also be sentencing me. I will not be able to see Derek, talk to him on the phone, or give him our special hug. Plus the fact that when he is released, his father and I most likely will not be here. Derek, my happiest moment is when I gave birth to you. And my second is when I was honored to pin your police badge on you. I remember you whispering to me, "Don't stick me with it." Derek, I want you to know I have always believed in your innocence, and I will never waver from that. I have read numerous letters from people around the world that also believe in your innocence. matter where you go, where you are, I will always be there to visit you. I promise you I will stay strong, as we talked about, and I want you to do the same for me. I will do what you told me to do, take care of myself, so I will be here for you when you come home. Remember, there is no stronger bond or love than a mother's love. And one final thought I want you to remember. Remember, you are my favorite son. Thank you for your time.
Mr. Nelson.
Thank you very much, Your Honor. It is my intent that my remarks this afternoon be quite brief. I do not intend to relitigate the facts of this case, nor spend any substantial time looking at the law. The court is very familiar with the facts of this case, and the parties have fully briefed the court relevant to the sentencing factors. And we recognize that in any case, any sentencing that comes before the court is tasked with a difficult job. The court must craft a sentence that serves the interests of justice, a rather nebulous term. The court must take into consideration the victim impact, public interest, as well as the circumstances and the history of the defendant. And in this case, more than any other, that likely any of us have ever been involved in, that task is exceedingly more difficult. In my remarks today, I just wish to briefly address each of those three considerations, starting with the public impact. As I believe we are all cognizant of, this case is at the epicenter of a cultural and political divide. We tried to keep a lot of that out of the courtroom during the trial and make this case about the facts. But we recognize what has happened as a result of this case. There are a great number of people who will view any sentence you pronounce as overly lenient and insufficient to satisfy justice. But there are an equal number of people who will view any sentence you pronounce as draconian or overbearing. Either way, some percentage of the public will view your sentence as a miscarriage of justice. The intensity of the public interest in this case cannot be understated. I trust that the volume of correspondence that each of us has received from the public at large is indicative of these very sentiments on both sides. As I was informed just yesterday, the Attorney General's office established a website, web submission, to accept community impact statements. Again, in my understanding is in a little over 2 weeks, they received over 1,000 submissions. Again, on both sides. By my very best estimate, since my representation of Mr. Chauvin began last summer, I would estimate that I have received over 5,000 emails, over 1,000 voicemails, and hundreds of handwritten letters. Again, from both sides. And I expect that Your Honor has likewise been inundated with public comment and scrutiny. The impact that this case has had on this community is profound. It goes far beyond what happened on May 25th of last year. It has been at the forefront of our national consciousness, and it has weaved its way into nearly every facet of our lives, from the entertainment that we consume to the presidential politics, from protests to conspiracy theories. In the end, it is my sincere hope that when this proverbial dust settles, the community impact brings forth principled debate and civil public discourse, and ultimately leaves a positive effect on the city of Minneapolis, the state of Minnesota, and the United States. But nevertheless, while this court may consider the community impact, it is for these very same reasons that the court must turn to the foundational legal principles and remember that justice is blind. Law is built on reason and common sense, and it cannot be permitted to be assailed by public opinion. Turning to the second consideration, which is the victim impact, the death of George Floyd. The death of George Floyd was tragic. He is loved by his family members. He is loved by his friends. And his death is justifiably mourned by those whose lives he impacted. He is a son, a brother, a father, an uncle, and a friend to many. And as the court heard today, the impact and the loss of his life, simply just, it can't be simplified. And it will take time. Finally, Your Honor, the court must take into consideration, just like it has to take into consideration the aggravating factors, it needs to take into consideration the mitigating factors. And the mitigating factors as set forth by the sentencing guidelines really point to the TROG analysis, essentially, ultimately in this case. We're not going to spend a lot of time, again, arguing for a probationary sentence. That's briefed. But that being said, when we look at the TROG factors, who is Derek Chauvin? Derek Chauvin spent 19 years as a Minneapolis police officer. He loved being a police officer. I was contacted during the course of my representation and have had numerous conversations with his fellow police officers or fellow police officers that worked with Derek, some retired, some still active. And they told me that he was a solid police officer, that he did his job, that if somebody asked him to do a particular task, he never complained, he did it. One person told me that one of his sergeants told me that if I had asked him to dig a ditch for 8 hours, he would have picked up a shovel and he would have never complained for a second. He would have done his job. He was decorated as a police officer, multiple life-saving awards. He was decorated for valor. He was proud to be a police officer because what he liked to do was help people. And as the statistics show, the vast majority of police work is helping people. He was proud to be a Minneapolis police officer. He served his country as the United States in the United States Army. And he too is a son, and a brother, and a father, and a friend. He too, his life, the life he has lived, he's not coming into this as a career criminal with 6 points, 5 points, 4 points. He's coming into this never having violated the law because he lived an honorable life and he attempted to live an honorable life. Derek Chauvin was not even scheduled to work on May 25th, 2020. He volunteered because there was short staffing at the time. I know from numerous conversations that I've had with Derek that his brain is littered with what ifs. What if I just had not agreed to go in that day? What if things had gone differently? What if I never responded to that call? What if, what if, what if? The truth of the matter is, and the end result is that we are here after a jury verdict, finding him guilty of these offenses. And the court's consideration should not only be focused on the aggravating factors, but the mitigating factors as well. The Minnesota Sentencing Guidelines Commission was established for a reason. And yes, the court in circumstances like these has discretion to go beyond and aggravate a sentence beyond the presumptive sentences established by the sentencing guidelines. But the sentencing guidelines don't differentiate between second-degree murders. Someone robs a liquor store, a police officer is involved in an incident, and a person dies in police custody. The law presumes, the legislature presumes, that the sentencing guidelines as established is a sufficient penalty for all of the second-degree murder categories or cases you would see. From 2019 back to 2010, a total of 90 people were sentenced for second-degree murder. Those sentences, those people, there were more than that, but people who had a 0 criminal history score, more than 90 people were sentenced. 67%, or 60 of those 90 people, received a guideline sentence of 150 months. So 2/3 of all people in this same position received a guideline sentence. 20% received an aggravated sentence, 18 of the 90, and 13% or 12 individuals were granted mitigated departures. So if the legislature and the intent of the sentencing guidelines is to eliminate sentencing disparity, the law should presume that the guideline sentence is what is appropriate in this case. Judge you may take into consideration at this point those aggravating factors, but you have to counterbalance them, which is the goal of the law, with the mitigating factors. I know that this has been an incredibly difficult case for the Floyd family to have to endure. The state of Minnesota, likewise, the prosecutors in this case have endured quite a bit, as has Mr. Chauvin's family. This is a case that has changed the world to some degree, and I hope it's positive. But it's my hope that the court follows the sentencing guidelines, applies the law in a reasoned manner, and imposes a just sentence.
Actually, Mr. Chauvin, would you join Mr. Nelson at the lectern? Mr. Chauvin, this is your opportunity if you wish to give any input to the court. And so I turn it over to you and your attorney.
Thank you, Your Honor. At this time, due to some additional legal matters at hand, I'm not able to give a full formal statement at this time. But very briefly, though, I do want to give my condolences to the Floyd family. There's going to be some other information in the future that would be of interest, and I hope things will give you some peace of mind. Thank you.
And I'll note that I did read your comments in the pre-sentence investigation as well.
Thank you, Judge.
All right, we are going to take a 15-minute recess so that I can complete the sentencing order based on what I've heard today. And let's reconvene at 2:45. We're in recess.
All right, so you have been watching live the sentencing phase now underway for former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin for the murder of George Floyd. Of course, we've been listening to the prosecutors lay out various aggravating factors, and then we've heard from the defense lay out their mitigating factors, their arguments for a reduced sentence. They're actually asking for probation plus time served. And also notably, apart from hearing very powerful victims' impact statements from two of George Floyd's brothers, his nephew, and his daughter, we also heard for the very first time from Derek Chauvin's mother. This is the first time any any member of the Chauvin family has spoken on his behalf publicly since his conviction. Our Julia Janae is live in Minneapolis right now. She has been monitoring the situation in and out of court, the crowds there reacting. So first of all, what is the overall feeling there that you've been able to ascertain?
Well, the crowds outside the courthouse, they are watching this as it's happening. You could hear them cheering when the brother of George Floyd, Philonise Floyd, was asking for a maximum sentence. You could also hear some boos from them when the prosecutor was saying that we need to be able to trust police and that most of them are trustworthy. So they are reacting to this as it's happening, and now hearing from the defendant for the first time. This was a moment, Joy, because we haven't heard him say anything or give any condolences to the family, but then giving almost a cryptic statement about things coming out in the future that he hopes will give them some peace of mind. We know he does have several other legal proceedings that will be coming in the future, including what we expect will be an appeal, but those federal charges that are against him. But interesting way to end while we wait for Judge Cahill to come back with his punishment.
Yeah, and it is interesting because obviously the victims' impact statements are so emotional, so heartfelt. And then you hear from Derek Chauvin's mother, also very emotional. She said, when you sentence my son, you will also be sentencing me. And when he gets out, I likely won't be here. So, you know, normally, or oftentimes I should say, during a sentencing phase, these statements are made before a jury. Here, it's being made before a judge. So I'm wondering what impact you think that will have, given that these are kind of emotion-based statements.
You know, it's always hard to tell when it comes to a judge who is rendering a sentence. We know a judge is really going to be looking at the legal arguments, the sentencing guidelines, what these parties and attorneys have to say about the law and the facts in the case. But the victim impact statements are important, and they are something to be taken into consideration. And the way these were presented by both sides were very moving. The prosecution starting out with Gianna Floyd talking about her dad via video. I mean, if there had been a jury in this room, you can imagine how much weight that would, how far that would go with a jury, hearing from the daughter who now no longer has a father and will always have these questions about what happened to him. But then, as you mentioned, on the defendant's side, hearing from his mother, someone who has not spoken out and has likely had to stay in hiding because of the response to what her son's actions were on that day, to stand publicly in front of this judge and ask for his life and also to declare his innocence. It will be interesting to hear from the judge if he makes any, if he addresses at all, rather, what was said by both sides and how that has impacted what he ultimately gives as Derek Chauvin's sentence.
And Julia, Janae, we understand, of course, that this recess will be ending soon with the judge. We're going to just take a quick break here, and we're going to continue. And as we anticipate more from Judge Cahill in the sentencing of former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin for the murder of George Floyd.
give any input to the court. And so I turn it over to you and your attorney.
Thank you, Your Honor. At this time, due to some additional legal matters at hand, I'm not able to give a full formal statement at this time. But very briefly, though, I do want to give my condolences to the Floyd family. There's going to be some other information in the future that would be of interest, and I hope things will give you some peace of mind. Thank you.
And I'll note that I did.
So Derek Chauvin offering condolences to the Floyd family and also sharing kind of a cryptic message about what he may be foreshadowing. We have our Julia Janae on the ground in Minneapolis. We have Julie Grant joining me right here in our Court TV studios. So what do you make of what we just heard from Derek Chauvin? Julia, let's start with you.
I'm a little bit flabbergasted as to what that could mean. He's saying that there's something that's going to come out in the future that didn't come out at trial, which was a pretty extensive trial, and his attorney has tried everything. And will it be something that has to do with him? Will it have to do with the Minneapolis Police Department? But it was an interesting way to end this sentencing hearing, to address the family of George Floyd in that manner.
So, Julie, we've been discussing, of course, throughout the day how far apart prosecution and defense are on their individual proposals for sentencing. Obviously, prosecution calling for 30 years while the defense is calling for just probation and time served. So, listening to what we just heard, do you think that has any impact on all of this?
Yes, I think it certainly does. I think this judge is a very thoughtful judge, Joy. I think he's certainly taking into account the verbal arguments that we heard made on the record today, and then also the written arguments that were submitted in memorandums of law prior to today by both the defense and the prosecution. And no doubt this judge has been thinking about all of these aggravating factors that he already found exist, as well as other things about anticipating the victim impact statements ahead of today. So I would say he's certainly taken into account what we've heard, but I think this has been a decision that's been weighing on his mind for quite some time, probably since that verdict came in back in April, because he knows the world is watching this decision. And these two sides, as you mentioned, they are miles apart from one another, and he's going to have to articulate on the record orally, and then of course I'm sure he'll probably do it in writing as well in the way of an opinion that we'll see on the court docket later, why he is finding the way he is.
So, Julia, we know that earlier in June that Judge Cahill already ruled that the facts of this case do support the 4 aggravating factors, which the prosecution is pushing towards for a 30-year sentence. The fact that they say Chauvin abused his position of authority, that he was especially cruel to George Floyd, that he was part of a group when he committed this crime, that it was done in the presence of minors. So how persuasive are the mitigating arguments that we just heard from the defense?
This is when you feel the real weight of the judge's ability to use discretion, because he has already ruled that those factors do exist, that the state has proven them beyond a reasonable doubt. Today, you saw the defense really focusing on the background of Derek Chauvin, the fact that he's not a career criminal, is what Eric Nelson said to the court, that you can't treat him like someone who comes into this courtroom who has killed someone, but has also had a long list of crimes or arrests. So it will be interesting to see how the judge addresses that statement, if he talks about that background of this defendant. He does have a 0 score for criminal history, and that is a big part of the sentencing guidelines and how those are parsed out here in Minnesota. But we, of course, know the judge is likely going to be outside of those sentencing guidelines because those aggravating factors were proven.
And it was so emotional listening to the victims' impact statements today, particularly from George Floyd's young daughter, Gianna. Let's play a clip.
What do you miss most about your daddy?
Well, I ask about him all the time. And that's kind of it.
Yeah. Well, when you ask about him, what are you asking about?
Well, I was asking, how did my dad get hurt?
Do you wish that he was still here with us?
Yeah, but he is.
Through his spirit?
Yes.
Yes. And when you see your daddy again one day, what do you want to do when you see him?
I want to play with him.
What kind of games do you want to play with him?
I want to play with him, have fun, go on a plane ride, and that's it.
Yeah.
We used to have dinner meals every single night before we went to bed. My daddy always used to help me brush my teeth.
Oh. Do you miss him helping brush your teeth?
Yes.
How do you hope that the world remembers him?
Well, they help him because those mean people did something to him.
Yeah. If you could say anything to your daddy right now, what would it be?
It would be, I miss you and I love you.
You know, I think we've all just been moved listening to little Gianna, and you know, we have to remember that no matter where the sentencing falls, it's just a terrible loss of life and such an impact on this family and this young girl. Let's set that aside for a moment and the emotions of all that, and looking at the act itself. How much can the judge act in a vacuum here, given that the eyes of the entire world are on him and on this particular case? Is it possible for him to truly decide this only based on this isolated incident outside of everything that may be broken with our criminal justice system? Julia, let me start with you.
Well, you know, the way the prosecution has argued this case and the way that they want the judge to sentence Chauvin to 30 years, they've continually just talked about the substantial and compelling reasons that they are presenting. And it is focused on what happened. I mean, this is what impacted the rest of the world. Seeing George Floyd begging for his life and crying. There being bystanders and children who were victims because of what they saw, a man losing his life. So I think the impact is still there and included in what the judge is taking into consideration. Perhaps not the magnitude of the world seeing this viral video, but certainly the way that George Floyd died and the people who were impacted by seeing it. And we also know the community impact statements are part of the record. The Attorney General's office garnered those from the public. So that will be part of what Judge Cahill is weighing.
Yeah, Julie, you know, what do you think that? I know that we were all emotionally moved listening to little Gianna, but again, I mean, this is supposed to be decided on the facts of this case and theoretically done in a vacuum. So what is the judge going to be looking at here, Julie?
Sure. Well, several things. Yes, the judge cannot consider any other cases. He solely has to look at the facts of this case. Yes, that is absolutely right, Joy. If I may just divert for a moment, Gianna Floyd, I hope she knows that the world loves her. This little child, I mean, your heart just breaks seeing her share these thoughts and these feelings, and you just see how sweet and innocent and kind she is, and what a tremendous loss this is for her. Right now, she's 7 years old, you know, and every year to come, you know, it may get far worse for her. And I think that child is going to grow up and do big, big things. And she wants her dad to know how much she loves him. Well, I hope she knows the world loves her. And this case has effectuated change. We've certainly seen that. We've certainly seen a movement that was spawned through this, and attention being paid to our criminal justice system and to the way that cases are handled, the way a certain protocol is carried out. We know there have been changes in Minneapolis, Minnesota, with the way the police department does their training and what they advise their officers of and make sure they are mindful of when effectuating various arrests and encounters. And so I think that Gianna Floyd will be carrying on her father's legacy for years and years to come. And today, certainly Judge Cahill heard sweet little Gianna loud and clear, and I'm sure it tugged at his heartstrings too, as it does everyone's. And these victim impact statements can be considered because we know at the time of sentencing, other factors can come in, just like they come in for the defendant. These other factors, like the effect this heinous crime has had on the Floyd family, comes into play too. And so the judge, rightfully so, can consider how this has hurt the Floyd family so deeply, and nothing can replace their loved one. And also he can consider the things that Derek Chauvin's counsel has presented, like his ability to comply with orders, with everything so far that's been asked of him, his decorum in the courtroom. And he can take into account the fact that he may have presented a larger legal statement if there weren't other matters outstanding. We know he's got the federal case outstanding, his appeal that we can bet is coming. And at the least, I was very pleased to see that there were condolences directed at the Floyd family. I had hoped today, Joy, going into sentencing, that would be something that we would see, and we did.
Yeah. And of course, we're continuing to monitor sentencing. We do want to note that the parties are back in the courtroom, so we're just awaiting the judge at this moment, just to be on standby for that. Julia, I want to delve a little bit more into this mitigating factor about Derek Chauvin being, according to his attorney, a product of a broken system. Because there's a lot to unpack here. Obviously, this case has raised so many issues, as we've been discussing, about systemic racism, police brutality, and criminal justice, the need for reform of the criminal justice system, many would argue. So when we look at this mitigating factor, that's part of the defense argument, that Chauvin is a product of a broken system, is it meant to kind of distinguish between this individual police officer and the larger issue of police brutality, do you think, Julia?
Oh, that's absolutely what the defense is wanting this judge to consider, that it's not Derek Chauvin who committed this as far as going outside of what he was taught, what his protocol was. That's what we saw during the trial, that the defense really tried to hammer home that this was conduct that was typical for other officers, that this was his understanding, being an officer on the street patrolling, having been with the MPD for 19 years. And for the sentencing memo from the defense to say that he is part of this broken system is almost an attempt to attach Derek Chauvin to part of the Justice for George Floyd movement, that he is really not an integral cog, but he's a pawn in this system that was broken, and he was only following orders. That's what we continue to hear from the defense, is that he thought he was doing his job, that he didn't get up in the morning and decide to hurt George Floyd or to kill him, but that he thought he was doing what a police officer was supposed to do. So that has been the theme of the defense's case, and we're seeing it continue into sentencing.
And Derek Chauvin's own mother, she described him as a quiet, honorable, selfless, big-hearted man, always put others before himself. And it was the first time we've heard from her publicly since his conviction and charges. Let's listen to a clip from her speaking and addressing the court.
It has been difficult for me to hear and read what the media, public, and prosecution team believe Derek to be an aggressive, heartless, and uncaring.
Well, first of all, I wanted to thank everybody for being here and for providing the input you did. Not just the people who were in the courtroom here, but also those who provided written statements, both from the Floyd family and the defendant's family. I've read all the impact statements that were submitted earlier and listened carefully to all the input here today. And it is truly appreciated that you took the time to stay with this case and to provide me with input. I have reviewed the pre-sentence investigation and carefully considered all the facts of the case and the law, but my comments are actually going to be very brief because most of it's going to be in writing. I have a 22-page memorandum that is going to be attached to the sentencing order. And why am I doing it in writing? To emphasize the fact that determining the appropriate sentence in any case, and in this case, is a legal analysis. It's applying the rule of law to the facts of an individual and specific case. And that is why, as opposed to trying to being profound here on the record, I prefer that you read the legal analysis that explains how I determine the sentence in the case. What the case is, or what the sentence is not based on, is emotion or sympathy. But at the same time, I want to acknowledge the deep and tremendous pain that all the families are feeling, especially the Floyd family. You have our sympathies. And I acknowledge and hear the pain that you are feeling. I acknowledge the pain not only of those in this courtroom, but the Floyd family who are outside this courtroom and other members of the community. It has been painful throughout Hennepin County, throughout the state of Minnesota, and even the country. But most importantly, we need to recognize the pain of the Floyd family. I'm not going to attempt to be profound or clever, because it's not the appropriate time. I'm not basing my sentence also on public opinion. I'm not basing it on any attempt to send any messages. A trial court judge, the job of a trial court judge is to apply the law to specific facts and to deal with individual cases. And so, Mr. Chauvin, as to count one, based on the verdict of the jury finding you guilty of unintentional second-degree murder while committing a felony under Minnesota Statute 609.19 subdivision 2 paren 1, it is the judgment of the court that you now stand convicted of that offense. Pursuant to Minnesota Statute section 609.04, counts 2 and 3 will remain unadjudicated as they are lesser offenses of count 1. As sentenced for count 1, the court commits you to the custody of the Commissioner of Corrections for a period of 270 months. That's 270. That is a 10-year addition to the presumptive sentence of 150 months. This is based on your abuse of a position of trust and authority, and also the particular cruelty shown to George Floyd. You're granted credit for 199 days already served. Pay the mandatory surcharge of $78 to be paid from prison wages. You're prohibited from possessing firearms, ammunition, or explosives for the remainder of your life. Provide a DNA sample as required by law. Register as a predatory offender as required by law. And then you will receive a copy of the order and also the attached memorandum explaining the court's analysis. Anything further from the state?
If this needs to be said, we just ask that it be executed forthwith.
Defendant is remanded to the custody of the sheriff to be transported back to the DOC or whichever custody is currently holding him. Anything for the defense? All right, thank you. We are adjourned.
All right, so there you have it. Derek Chauvin sentenced to 270 months in addition to the 10 years. So that would be 22.5 years, if I'm doing math correctly, credit for time served as well. And the judge being very careful to articulate that his job is to apply the law to specific facts. He acknowledges the great pain of the families of both Derek Chauvin and George Floyd, particularly George Floyd's family, and expressed great sympathy to the Floyd family and to the community. And as the nation watched on, many community members impacted by this. But he said his job here is just to decide based on the facts what he should do according to the rule of law. Julia Janae, of course, you have been on the ground in Minneapolis. You've followed this case from the beginning. What is your reaction?
Joy, I do want to tell you what the reaction is outside right now, because our field producer, Emanuela Grinberg, is actually out there where people were holding hands and waiting for this sentence to come through. First, no reaction, because it seemed like they were trying to do the math. What does 270 months mean? 22.5 years is what it is, but they're still reacting and understanding what that means. So 22.5 is what legal experts suggested would be the sentence. It is not the request from the prosecution, which was 30 years, but it is outside the guidelines, which the maximum of that was 15. So I think this is in keeping with what we have seen from Judge Peter Cahill throughout this case, that he has been very measured and thoughtful in the way that he delivers his renderings or judgments in this case. So no different for the sentence for Derek Chauvin.
Yeah. Julie, you've had various experts on today who I watched, and, I heard a range of, I guess, anticipated sentences that I heard. Obviously, prosecution was pushing for 30 years, and then we had the defense saying they wanted just probation and time served. Is this the sentence that you expected to hear today?
It's close, Joy. I wouldn't have been surprised if the judge sided completely with the state on this one and went with 30 years, because when you read their memorandum of law that they submitted in support of their position arguing for 30 years, they talk about how they're asking for double the highest number in the range. So the sentencing guideline range for this crime, 10 to 15 years for Derek Chauvin. 12 and a half is right in the middle. I'm going to go back to that number in a second. But what they did was they took that high number 15 and they cited case law that says when you have these aggravators like you do in this case, the fact that children were present, witnessed the murder, that it was particularly cruel, and so on and so forth, you can double that number. So that's how they arrived at 30. When in doing the math, I'm in agreement with Julia. I can see how everybody was kind of stunned, because I think we all here were pulling out our phones and our calculators and trying to figure it out. I'm not sure why His Honor didn't just say that is 22 and a half years. But how he got to that number, he said he took that presumptive sentence guideline range in the middle, which would be 12 and a half, took that 12 and a half that falls in the middle of 10 to 15 and then added 10 more years. And so he did depart upwardly by 10 years from that. So that's how he's arriving at that number. 25 years in Minnesota is what someone might receive when it's an intentional murder. So the fact that this is an unintentional one, sometimes we have to remind ourselves of what degree it is and what variation under the law he was prosecuted under. You can see where that finding by Judge Peter Cahill would be supported by these numbers and then that upward departure accordingly. So I think, to answer your question, yes, it is very close. I could have seen him going higher and I wouldn't have been surprised. But I think, as we will see as we read that memorandum of law, that 22-page memo that he is attaching to the court record, we will see how he arrived so carefully at that finding.
Interesting to me that when the judge delivered his sentence, he cited 2 of the aggravating factors, not 4 of the aggravating factors. He did not, unless I missed something, tell me if you heard something I didn't. He did not cite what the prosecution cited, that Derek Chauvin committed this act as part of a group. And remember, defense had said that isn't fair because the other 3 officers have not been convicted. And additionally, unless, again, correct me if I missed something, he did not cite the fact that this was committed in the presence of children. And remember, the defense refuted that aggravating factor in their mitigation argument, saying, look, this line of reasoning is reserved for situations where children are there from the outset and cannot leave, such as domestic situations. Here, we happen to be in a public place. The children could have left or been removed from the situation, so not applicable. But what he did emphasize in his sentencing today was that Derek Chauvin abused his authority and acted with particular cruelty. And those were the 2 aggravating factors I heard him really hammer home when he was delivering that sentence. 22.5 years. Let's also remember that the defense was very careful to highlight that Derek Chauvin had really a stellar background on paper, that there were no prior criminal offenses, that he had spent 19 years on the service, that he had achieved various honors and commendations and achieved high scores on his reviews and so forth. But Julie, I remember on your show earlier today, you had an analyst point out, well, the reason why his record appears to be clean is that he benefits from a broken criminal justice system. And so he may be getting away with what is illegal because he is a police officer. Julia, do you think that played into this decision to sentence Derek Chauvin to 22.5 years today?
I think Judge Cahill said it best, that he is looking at this individual case, that he is not taking emotion into this. He is not looking at some of the things that people may have been asking him to do, which is to send a message with this case, but that he looked at the facts, the law, the arguments, and I will be looking forward to reading his full sentencing memorandum to understand exactly how he's going to explain it to the public, because I think that's important in this case, that the public will need to understand how he arrived there. Just to give you some more updates from what's happening outside, we're monitoring the crowds that have gathered, that there seemed to be a mixed reaction, according to our field producer who's down there, that some people are seeming to be okay with that number, others very upset, cursing. There are some calls for peace from some of the elders who are in that crowd and trying to assemble people to pray during this time. So it seems that they are slowly understanding exactly how much time that is, how much you'll actually serve behind bars, and reacting to that there in front of the courthouse.
Thank you so much, Julia. Okay, so just 3 minutes after 4 o'clock on this Friday, June 25th, it's just to reset for our viewers who are just joining us. It's been 2 months now since Derek Chauvin, the former Minneapolis police officer, was convicted of murdering George Floyd. And what we've been delivering to you live right here on Court TV is the sentencing of Derek Chauvin for unintentional second-degree murder, a felony, of course, in Minneapolis, in Minnesota. And 22.5 years is the sentence just delivered by Judge Cahill just a short time ago. We brought that to you live right here on Court TV. For those of you who were not able to join us, we're going to play that for you. But for right now, what you're looking at, these are live images from outside the courthouse in Minneapolis, at the Hennepin County Government Center. You can see the reaction of observers there. Let's listen for a moment. Okay, listen, I understand actually it's so impassioned that there is some profane language that we actually will not be sharing with you at this moment. But you can certainly see that many people are gathered outside just to hear the sentence delivered just moments ago. Let's go ahead and play you a clip from the verdict.
Mr. Chauvin, as to count one, based on the verdict of the jury, finding you guilty of unintentional second-degree murder while committing a felony under Minnesota Statute 609.19 subdivision 2, paren 1, it is the judgment of the court that you now stand convicted of that offense. Pursuant to Minnesota Statute section 609.04, counts 2 and 3 will remain unadjudicated as they are lesser offenses of count 1. As sentence for count 1, the court commits you to the custody of the Commissioner of Corrections for a period of 270 months. That's 270. That is a 10-year addition to the presumptive sentence of 150 months. This is based on your abuse of a position of trust and authority, and also the particular cruelty shown to George Floyd. You are granted credit for 199 days already served. Pay the mandatory surcharge of $78 to be paid from prison wages. You're prohibited from possessing firearms, ammunition, or explosives for the remainder of your life. Provide a DNA sample as required by law. Register as a predatory offender as required by law. And then you will receive a copy of the order and also the attached memorandum explaining the court's analysis.
So that verdict delivered just a short time ago by Judge Cahill. You saw that reaction there from Derek Chauvin, the fired former Minneapolis police officer convicted of killing George Floyd. Of course, our Julia Janae has been on the ground in Minneapolis covering this trial from the beginning. Julie Grant joining us in studio, bringing her analysis as well and perspective. Julia, it looked like people on the courtyard there of the Hennepin County Government Center and courthouse seem very, very impassioned.
very impassioned, and I can tell you some of them are not happy with the finding of Judge Cahill. Some are disappointed. We're even hearing from the aunts of the victim in this case, George Floyd. Angela Harrelson and her twin sister Mahalia, they've actually been speaking with Court TV today before this sentence, but we're now getting word that they expected that it was going to be more. They are disappointed that it was not more than that, even quote saying that black men get longer time for lesser crimes. So we're going to be hearing from the crowd on how they feel about this 22.5-year sentence. A lot of people comparing it to the sentences that they've seen in other cases, some of which don't involve a violent crime.
Yeah, and as you were speaking, we were looking at images there of some observers gathered there on the courtyard. One young woman looked so upset, and frankly, I'd say she looked like she was in pain. And then we saw another young woman come and put her hand to the camera, just kind of to avoid the public seeing what was happening. And it's important to acknowledge, which the judge did, that what George Floyd had to endure, it brought pain to really around the world. It brought pain to so many people. No matter where you fall, no matter what you believe the sentence should be for this killing. Julie Grant, you know, looking at this reaction, looking at, of course, the strong emotions on many sides of this case, how do you think that this would be received, for instance, in the policing community?
Well, you know, I think it's a tough question to answer because I know that having served as a prosecutor and become close with many law enforcement officers, I haven't met one who approved of Derek Chauvin's conduct that day. And I would encourage folks, as we continue to try to build relationships between communities and police departments across the country, to speak to officers, because we cannot hold every officer accountable for the actions of one. You know, he was prosecuted by himself. He got his sentence by himself. You know, and as far as how they might see the sentence, that's a tricky question because many things go into the sentencing guidelines. For instance, when we were talking about that range of 10 to 15 years, that number in the middle being 12 and a half, which Judge Cahill departed upwardly by 10 years, getting that 22.5-year sentence. When you think about those numbers, the big thing that goes into that is Derek Chauvin has no prior criminal history. He's got a big goose egg. So, for instance, someone else, let's say we have a defendant who's a repeat felon, always finding himself in the criminal system. That person's, let's just say, convicted of the same crime under the same circumstances and everything. They're going to be looking at guidelines, a presumptive sentence that is much, much, much higher. So everything, as you use the word, to be looked at in a vacuum, we have to look at every case individually. And that's something I always like to stress here on Court TV, that we can't lump all the cases in together or say that all police act alike or that everyone is treated the same way in the system. It's just simply not true. And oftentimes, I mean, I've seen the system work many, many times. And so I'm not saying it works every time, but all that being said, as far as the policing community goes, you know, I really don't have the answer to that because, you know, I think it's been hard to see an outward showing of support when most of what the public is seeing is such a supportive movement for the Floyd family and for his loved ones who are feeling this unbearable pain. And so I think we shall see what comes after this. I think this is just the tip of the iceberg, though, Joy. I think that we still have to remember there's going to be an appeal coming. The conviction and sentencing order had to all be entered into the record. So today kind of closed that chapter at the trial court level, and then onward we will go to the appellate court level, watching as this case progresses. So we shall see what happens, and then also with the other three co-defendants whose cases are outstanding.
But it is interesting to note that, of course, the chief of Minneapolis police denounced that behavior and was careful to distance the entire department and the policing community from what Derek Chauvin did. We want to go back to the victims' impact statements, which were very powerful, that we heard earlier before the sentence was actually delivered. Let's listen to a clip from Terrence Floyd, the brother of George Floyd.
On behalf of me and my family, we seek the maximum penalty. We don't want to see no more slaps on the wrist. We've been through that already. In my community.
Okay, let's listen live to Keith Ellison.
My name is Keith Ellison. I'm the Attorney General for the state of Minnesota. And on behalf of the prosecution team, we want to thank the Floyd family, Brandon Williams, Terrence Floyd, Philanese Floyd, and Gigi, who offered their testimony to the court and gave their heartfelt feelings about the impact of this horrific crime on their family. We heard for the first time from George Floyd's 6-year-old daughter. What a delightful, beautiful child. And my heart really is with the entire Floyd family as they figure out how to explain to her what happened as she grows up. The sentence that the court just imposed on Derek Chauvin, 270 months or 22 and a half years, is one of the longest a former police officer has ever received for an unlawful use of deadly force. Like the conviction of Derek Chauvin 2 months ago, today's sentencing is not justice, but it is another moment of real accountability on the road to justice. It's difficult to see anyone lose their freedom, but seeing somebody lose their life through torture over 9.5 minutes is incomparably worse. Those minutes and seconds are inerasably seared into the minds of people across the world who watched George Floyd die. Above all, the heroic people who stopped and bore witness to George Floyd's suffering and torture, who came forward a year later to testify about what they saw, and to the Floyd family members themselves and their counsel, Ben Crump, Tony Romanucci, we say thank you. The lives of everyone who saw what happened to George Floyd are forever changed. My hope for Derek Chauvin is that he uses his long sentence to reflect on the choices that he made on May 25th, 2020. My hope is that he will find it within himself to acknowledge the impact of his choices on George Floyd, his family, his fellow police officers, and the world. My hope is that he takes the time to learn something about the man whose life he took and about the movement that rose up to call for justice in the wake of George Floyd's torture and death. Today is also an important moment for our country. The outcome of this case is critically important, but by itself, it's not enough. My hope for our country is that this moment gives us pause and allows us to rededicate ourselves to the real societal change that will move us much further along the road to justice. I'm not talking about the kind of change that takes decades. I'm talking about real change, concrete change that real people can do now. I'm talking to lawmakers. At this historic moment, there is so much legislation around the country, in city councils, county boards, state legislatures, and Congress, that is still waiting to be passed. If these bills were passed, they would make the deaths at the hands of law enforcement officers less likely, would improve police-community relations, would restore trust and therefore cooperation, improve the lives of officers who want to protect and serve, and make everyone safer. Every one of these bills at every level of government is critical for helping our families, our law enforcement officers, communities, and the country heal. Above all, Congress has still not passed the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. I call on leaders and members of Congress to pass the best and strongest version of this bill that can be passed, and to pass it now. President Biden called on the Congress to pass this bill. It must be passed. Lives are depending upon it. It's just that simple. I'm speaking now to law enforcement leaders. At this historic moment, law enforcement leaders are in a position to finally put in place policy, training, mechanisms, and accountability that can build a police department that people can really trust and rely on. And the elected leaders that they answer to must support and empower these law enforcement leaders to do it. Where there is distrust between community and police, there is less cooperation between community and police. And at a moment where violent crime is spiking across the nation in major cities, we simply cannot afford the distrust. The schism leaves us all a little less safe. But trust and cooperation must be earned. You cannot clean a dirty wound. By bringing accountability in law enforcement, you actually promote public safety. I say to those law enforcement leaders, make no mistake, this is something your officers are asking for. In the aftermath of George Floyd's death, 14 Minneapolis Police Department officers signed an open letter condemning Derek Chauvin's actions and embracing the call for reform and change. These 14 officers don't only speak for themselves, they speak for hundreds across the country. These officers and ones like them want you to support officers who treat everyone with dignity and respect. They want you to support officers who are taking risks to speak up and demand that we do better. They want you to hold their colleagues accountable who refuse to serve communities with dignity and respect. Why do officers want accountability? Well, think of the 9-year-old girl wearing a t-shirt that said love across the front, who witnessed George Floyd's murder, and how she will feel 20 years from now as she may be speaking to her own children about whether to trust law enforcement. The damage that Derek Floyd's crime inflicted upon the reputation of officers is undermining the ability for people to trust, and that is very tragic. It's not fair to judge all police officers by Derek Chauvin's actions, but some people inevitably will generalize unless there is true accountability. You just can't heal a dirty wound, and when there's little trust, sadly, there's little safety. When law enforcement leaders take clear steps to build in accountability and prioritize wellness for their officers, they will have the officers' respect, trust between officers and the people they are dedicated to protecting and serving. Let me speak to prosecutors. We believe, and we state and declare, that no one is above the law and no one is beneath it. A police officer is not above the law, and George Floyd certainly is not beneath the law. When, after a thorough review, prosecutors believe that they have probable cause that anyone, including someone operating with the authority of law and law enforcement, has violated the law, our prosecutors must be vigorous, visible, and swift. I'm speaking to community now. We need every community member to continue the call for real reform and meaningful change. Peacefully, constructively, but clearly. This is a moment for change, and your call for it is making it happen. This means everyone who wants to live in a society with dignity and respect as core values, everyone who wants to be safe in their homes and on the street, everyone who wants to get the help that they need, everyone who wants their loved ones to get home safely. This is what we need to do. What will happen if we don't do it? We will slip deeper into a century-long cycle of inaction. We can and we must make another choice. The choice to break the old paradigm and end the cycle of inaction. The choice to act for accountability and justice. The choice to transform ourselves and our country. For the sake of all the lives that have been lost, for the sake of the terrible sacrifices that too many families like the Floyds have had to make, and for the sake of the many officers who strive to serve and protect with dignity and honor and high standards, and for the sake of the community. Time is up. It's time to act. We're counting on you. We're counting on each other. Finally, I want to thank this extraordinary team of prosecutors. It has been my deepest honor to work with you. You all are the best, and I'm honored to be your colleague. I want to send another strong signal of love and friendship to the Floyd family, who have done so much to uphold the dignity of our community. I want to thank the Hennepin County Attorney's Office and Mike Freeman, who have been side by side with us and have done such a good job, and we appreciate their work. And I want to thank the witnesses who courageously stepped forward for George Floyd on May 25th at risk to themselves and came back a year later to testify about what they saw. And lastly, I want to thank the community for making the call for justice. That's it. Thank you very much.
So you have been listening live to Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison remarking on the 22.5-year sentence to former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin, saying it's the longest sentence of any police officer in a use of force case. You know, he talked about the importance of holding police accountable, not just to improve relations between police officers and the community, but also to restore credibility to police officers. And, you know, he emphasized that when law enforcement is held accountable, it actually benefits law enforcement who are operating under the rule of law. And of course, we remember that during the trial, one of the state's star witnesses was Minneapolis Police Chief Arredondo, who was careful to emphasize that Derek Chauvin did not follow. It actually violated the police department's policies on de-escalation, reasonable use of force, and rendering aid. He clearly denounced Derek Chauvin's behavior. We see that echoed not only with Attorney General Keith Ellison's remarks, but also with this 22.5-year sentence today. Our Julie Grant is here with me live in studio. Julie, anything that jumps out to you after hearing from Mr. Ellison?
The one thing I was thinking about, Joy, is I was watching him speak, and he did a fine job with that statement. You could tell it was very well thought out and planned, and that was a real moment for him, his colleagues in his office, of course, in the Hennepin County DA's office, and all of those private attorneys that stepped in to help try this case. And I kept thinking about the countless hours that that team has spent to get to this moment here today where they have some closure in the trial phase with the sentence of 22.5 years, one that he seemed fairly pleased with, noting what you mentioned about it being the highest sentence he's aware of for an officer who's been convicted in a use of force case in a criminal court of law. And so I think it's important to remember, as we saw them hugging each other at the end there when we